The high plains sun of the Dakota Territory beat down on Redemption Creek, with the fury of a blacksmith's forge bleaching the dust of the main street to the color of bone. It was a town built on fragile hope and stubborn desperation, a place where the promise of a new life was traded daily for the grim reality of survival. On this sweltering Tuesday, the air hung thick with the smell of horse sweat, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty film. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air was still but no cooler. Jacob McGregor stood beside his wife Elena, the low hum of their conversation, a small private island in the public space. He was a man built like the West itself, broad-shouldered and weathered with eyes the pale, piercing blue of a winter sky. A former Texas Ranger, he carried a stillness about him that was often mistaken for disinterest, but was in fact the coiled calm of a man who had seen too much violence to ever be truly at ease. Elena, by contrast, was all light and life, her laughter soft as the rustle of cottonwood leaves could cut through the thickest gloom. As she spoke to the teller, her hand drifted to the silver locket at her throat, a habit of thought and comfort. It was a heavy, ornate piece, an heirloom passed down through her mother's line, its surface etched with intricate floral patterns worn smooth by generations of touch. For Jacob, that locket was Elena, a symbol of history grace, and a beauty that seemed too delicate for this harsh land. "Just a few more minutes, Jacob," she whispered, her smile reaching her dark, intelligent eyes. "Then we can finally get the seed for the south pasture." He nodded, a faint smile touching his own lips. "And then we head home. I don't like the feel of town today." His words were prophetic. The swinging saloon doors across the street burst open, not with the usual drunken stumble, but with the explosive force of a shotgun blast. 4 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, spilled into the street rifles held at the ready. Panic erupted like a flock of startled birds. People screamed, scattering in every direction, their frantic movements churning the dust into a blinding cloud. 2 of the bandits stormed the bank, their boots thundering on the wooden floorboards. "Nobody move," one of them roared, his voice a ragged bark. Jacob's ranger instincts flared to life. He moved instantly, shoving Elena behind him, his body a shield. His hand instinctively went to his hip, only to find it empty. He had stopped wearing his Colt Peacemaker, a conscious decision to leave that part of his life behind, buried with the men he'd hunted. It was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his days. The bank descended into chaos. The teller, a young man with more fear than sense, fumbled with the cash drawer. One of the robbers, impatient and cruel, swung the butt of his rifle, striking the man across the head. He crumpled to the floor with a sickening thud. The other bandit began herding the few customers into a corner, his eyes wild and darting. But the leader, a burly man with cold, dead eyes visible over his mask, was not focused on the money. His gaze swept the room and locked onto Elena, or more specifically, onto the glint of silver at her throat. "The locket," he snarled, pointing a grimy finger. "Give it to me." Elena's hand flew to her neck, clutching the heirloom protectively. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It was my mother's." The man took a menacing step forward. Jacob moved with him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Leave her be. Take the money and go." From outside, a gunshot cracked through the air. Sheriff Brody, a man perpetually out of his depth, was attempting to mount a defense. The sound was a spark to a powder keg. The bandit inside the bank flinched, his rifle swinging wildly. Another shot rang out from the street, this one shattering the bank's front window. A shard of glass spun through the air, and Jacob heard a sound he would never forget. A soft, surprised gasp from the woman behind him. He turned. Elena's eyes were wide, her hand still at her throat, but now a dark, impossible stain was spreading across the front of her simple cotton dress. She stumbled forward, her weight falling against him. A stray bullet, a random piece of lead in a symphony of chaos, had found its mark. "Jacob," she whispered, her breath catching. Time seemed to warp, slowing to a thick, syrupy crawl. As Jacob held her, trying to staunch a wound that was instantly obviously fatal, the bandit leader saw his chance. He lunged forward, his greedy fingers tearing the silver chain from Elena's neck. He didn't even glance at her. He just clutched the locket in his fist, his prize secured. "Let's go," he bellowed to his partner. They fled, leaving behind a dying woman, a grief-stricken husband, and a silence that was more deafening than the gunfire. Jacob knelt on the floor, Elena's head cradled in his lap, oblivious to the shouting outside, to the townspeople cautiously emerging from their hiding places. He saw only her face, the light fading from her beautiful eyes, and the raw red mark on her neck where the locket had been. The hollow in his chest was vast and immediate, a canyon carved out in a single, brutal moment. He had come to this land, seeking peace, a place to build a life. In the space of a heartbeat, it had taken everything. And in that moment, as he held his dying wife, Jacob McGregor's world did not just end. It burned down to ash, leaving behind only a single cold ember of purpose. Find the man who took the locket, and with it, the last piece of his wife's life. 2 years passed. The seasons turned with an indifference that felt like a personal insult to Jacob. The world moved on, but he remained frozen in that moment on the bank floor. He retreated from life, taking refuge in the one place that demanded nothing of him but sweat and silence, his homestead. Nestled in a shallow valley carved by the patient hands of Cottonwood Creek, his small patch of land was an island of self-imposed exile, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, and a lifetime from the man he used to be. The half-finished cabin he and Elena had started was now a fortress of solitude. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, his life a litany of grueling chores that left his body aching and his mind blessedly numb. He plowed fields, mended fences, and chopped wood with a relentless, mechanical fury, pouring his grief into the unforgiving soil. The land became a reflection of his soul, harsh, unyielding, and haunted by ghosts. The sun-bleached bones of a steer, half buried in the dust near his barn, served as a constant monument to the fragility of life. The wind whispering through the tall grass sounded like a forgotten secret, sometimes carrying the faint, imagined echo of Elena's laughter, a sound that was both a comfort and a torment. Redemption Creek and the town that had stolen his future became a place he visited only when necessity demanded it. On those rare trips, he was a specter, his face a grim, unreadable mask, his words few and clipped. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, whispering about the tragedy that had hollowed him out. They saw a man broken by grief. They did not see the cold, patient fire that still burned deep within him. The undisputed king of this small, dusty kingdom was Silas Croft. He was a rancher of immense wealth and influence, a man who had carved out an empire from the prairie with a combination of charm, ruthlessness, and an insatiable appetite for land. To the town, he was a patriarch, a bringer of order and prosperity. He funded the sheriff's office, sat on the town council, and hosted the annual 4th of July barbecue. His public face was one of civic duty and benevolent authority, but Jacob, with a ranger's eye for predators, saw the man beneath the veneer. He saw the cold calculation in Croft's eyes, the way his smile never quite reached them, and the possessive manner in which he surveyed the valley, as if it were all just a map of his own future acquisitions. Croft's obsession, for reasons Jacob could not fathom, had settled on his small homestead. It wasn't the most fertile land, nor the largest, but its one true prize was unfettered access to the year-round flow of Cottonwood Creek. In a land where water was life, that creek was gold. Croft had made offers, each one more insistent than the last. The first was polite, delivered with a sympathetic nod to Jacob's unfortunate situation. The second was condescending, a lecture on the foolishness of one man trying to tame such a wild piece of country. The third, delivered just a month prior, had been a veiled threat. "This is no place for a man alone." McGregor Croft had set his cold eyes, sweeping over the property with an owner's gaze. Savages, wolves, the winter. Any one of them could swallow you whole. A man needs neighbors, friends. A man needs to be part of a community. The unspoken message was clear, a community that Croft controlled. Jacob had simply gripped the handle of the axe he was holding and replied, his voice flat and dead. "I'm not selling Croft." The rejection had seemed to fuel Croft's desire, turning it into something personal. A contest of wills he was unaccustomed to losing. It was this undercurrent of menace, this feeling of being watched and coveted, that kept Jacob's old instincts sharp. He was a man who wanted to be left alone, but the world in the form of Silas Croft refused to oblige. One blistering afternoon in late August, the air hung thick and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Jacob was leading his mule Beatrice back from the creek, the animal laden with 2 full barrels of water. As he crested the small rise overlooking the lower flats, a primal instinct honed by years of tracking men who did not want to be found prickled the back of his neck. The silence was wrong. It was not the humming, insect-filled silence of a hot day. It was a dead silence, the kind that falls when every living thing is holding its breath. His eyes, accustomed to scanning distant horizons for threats, swept the landscape. He saw it almost immediately, a patch of land, 50 yards from the main channel, that looked deceptively solid. The settlers called it prairie gumbo, a treacherous mix of fine sand, clay, and water that could create a vacuum, pulling down anything with weight. Quicksand. And in the middle of it, 2 figures were struggling. A faint, high-pitched cry cut through the stillness. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a child. Jacob's hand went to the Winchester .73 rifle in his saddle scabbard, his mind instantly cataloging the possibilities. A trap. A lure set by bandits. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his cabin. The world had already taken enough from him. He owed it nothing. But then the cry came again, sharper this time, laced with a desperate terror that transcended language and politics. It was the sound of a child who believed he was about to die. He tethered Beatrice to a scraggly bush and pulled the Winchester free. Holding it at a low ready, he moved forward, his steps careful and deliberate, his eyes scanning every shadow, every rock. As he drew closer, the horrifying scene came into focus. 2 Lakota boys were trapped. The younger one, no older than 7 or 8, was submerged to his shoulders, his head barely above the surface, his face a mask of pure terror. The older boy, perhaps 12 or 13, was sunk to his chest. He was not screaming. His face was a stoic mask of grim determination, but his panicked struggles only served to pull him deeper into the mire. A pinto pony lay nearby, its life already surrendered to the sucking earth. The boys saw him. The older one, Chayton, went rigid. The fear in his eyes was instantly replaced with a defiant mistrust. He barked a sharp command in his native tongue, and his younger brother's cries, caught in his throat, replaced by hiccuping sobs. They stared at him, 2 wild, terrified creatures who saw not a potential savior, but an enemy. Jacob's mind was a battlefield. Leave them. It's not your fight. But his eyes were locked on the younger boy's face, streaked with mud and tears, and he saw not a savage, but a child. A child in the path of a slow, indifferent death. He thought of Elena, of the senselessness of her end. He could not stop the bullet that took her, but he could fight the mud that was taking them. He laid the Winchester down carefully on a patch of dry grass, a deliberate gesture. Chayton's eyes flickered to the discarded weapon, a spark of confusion in their depths. Jacob knew he needed leverage. He spotted a dead, sun-bleached cottonwood log 20 feet away. Adrenaline surged through him. Heaving with a strength born of labor and grief, he began to roll the heavy log toward the edge of the quicksand, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He positioned it as a bridge, a lifeline to the trapped boys. Without hesitation, he lay flat on his stomach and began to inch his way out over the muck. He needed a rope. Cursing, he backed off the log and sprinted to Beatrice, grabbing the thick lariat from her saddle. Back on the log, he crawled out again, the stench of decay rising from the mud below. He looped the rope into a wide lasso. "Put this over your head." He called out his voice, a gruff command. He mimed the motion, slipping an imaginary loop under his own arms. Chayton watched his face, a mixture of suspicion and dawning hope. He translated the gestures into a series of urgent commands to his brother. The little boy, fumbling with cold, muddy hands, managed to work the rope under his armpits. Jacob scrambled back to solid ground, planted his feet, and pulled. The suction was immense, like trying to uproot an ancient tree. He gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming, and pulled again with a raw cry of exertion. Slowly, agonizingly, the mud released its grip with a sickening slurp. He dragged the small boy to the safety of the log. "Now you," Jacob grunted, tossing the muddy rope to Chayton. The older boy was stronger, and with Jacob pulling, he fought his way free. Minutes later, both boys were lying on solid ground, covered in gray mud, shivering and exhausted. Jacob stood over them, his own body trembling, his hands raw from the rope. For a long, silent moment, the three of them were bound by the shared ordeal. Chayton pushed himself to a sitting position. He looked at Jacob, then at his brother, then at their dead pony. The hostility was gone from his eyes, replaced by a complex acknowledgement. He gave a short, sharp nod. Then, helping his younger brother to his feet, he turned, and without a backward glance, the two of them vanished into the tall prairie grass. Jacob was left alone with the certainty that his carefully constructed wall of isolation had just been breached. News like wildfire travels fast on an empty prairie. 3 days later, the dust cloud Jacob saw approaching from the east was not a surprise, but an inevitability. He recognized the riders instantly, Sheriff Brody, a man worn down by compromise, and beside him, Silas Croft, who sat his expensive saddle like a king, surveying his domain. Croft dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes raking over Jacob with unconcealed contempt. "McGregor," he began, dispensing with pleasantries. "We heard a rather disturbing story in town. Seems you've been playing nursemaid to a couple of Sioux pups." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Folks are saying you pulled them from the gumbo down by the creek, Jacob. People are spooked." "They were boys," Brody Jacob said, his voice flat. "And they were dying." Croft let out a short, derisive laugh. "They're all savages from the cradle to the grave. By saving them, you may have just put a target on the back of every decent soul in this valley. Their war party will see it as weakness. They'll come back not with thanks, but with torches and knives. I'll handle what comes to my door." Jacob replied, his gaze locked on Croft. Croft stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss, his words crafted for maximum cruelty. "I heard you lost your wife to a savage's bullet, McGregor. Funny how you've gone soft on them. Or maybe you're making new friends for protection." The words struck Jacob with the force of a physical blow. The carefully constructed dam, holding back 2 years of raw, unprocessed grief, cracked. The image of Elena gasping his name, of the locket being torn from her neck, flooded his mind. He had always accepted the official story, a random robbery, a stray bullet. But Croft's comment, dripping with a strange personal malice, planted a seed of doubt. The robbers hadn't acted like typical bandits. They had been chaotic, yes, but the leader's focus had been singular. The locket. Why? Sheriff Brody, seeing the dangerous light flicker in Jacob's eyes, quickly intervened. "That's enough, Silas. We're just warning you, Jacob. Be careful." As they rode away, Croft's final words hung in the air. "I made you a fair offer for this land, McGregor. When they come for you, you'll wish you'd taken it." The threat was no longer just about land. It was personal. That night, sleep offered no escape. Croft's taunt echoed in his thoughts, dredging up details from that horrible day he had forced himself to forget. The leader's eyes cold dead, but focused. Not on the cash drawer, but on Elena. On the locket. It wasn't a random robbery. The thought, once planted, took root and grew into a suffocating certainty. He had been so consumed by grief that he had failed to see what his ranger instincts should have told him from the start. Elena hadn't been a random victim. She had been a target. The next morning, driven by a new and terrible purpose, Jacob rode into Redemption Creek. He avoided the main street, tethering his horse behind the blacksmith's shop. The town felt different now, each familiar building seeming to hold a secret. His first stop was the alley behind the old bank, now a general mercantile. He knelt in the dirt where Elena had fallen the ground, still holding the ghost of that day. For 2 years he had avoided this spot, as if it were cursed. Now he searched it with the methodical precision of a hunter tracking his quarry. He spent nearly an hour sifting through dirt and debris, his fingers tracing the phantom outlines of the past. He found nothing but rusted nails and broken glass, until his hand brushed against something small and metallic, lodged beneath a loose floorboard of the boardwalk. It was a spent cartridge casing a .40-40-40 Winchester common enough. But as he turned it over in his palm, he saw the unique marking on the primer, a tiny, crudely scratched star. It was a handload, the mark of a man who customized his own ammunition. It was a clue, the first tangible thread he could pull. His investigation led him to Jebediah Stone, an old prospector who lived in a shack on the edge of town and saw more than he let on. Jacob found him nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey on his porch. Cartridge casing. Jebediah rasped, squinting at the brass shell. Seen a mark like that once. Fella who used to work for Croft. Name of Cletus. Bragged about his lucky star loads. Nasty piece of work. Haven't seen him in, close to 2 years now. Where did he live? Jacob asked, the cold ember in his gut glowing hotter. Had a line cabin up in the West Canyon. But you don't want to go poking around Croft's business, son. That man's got a long memory and a payroll full of short tempers. Jacob ignored the warning. He rode for the West Canyon, the landscape blurring past him. He found the cabin dilapidated and abandoned. Inside, the air was stale with disuse. He searched the place, finding nothing but dust and rat droppings, until he kicked aside a moldering straw mattress. Beneath it, a loose floorboard. And under the floorboard, a small rotting leather pouch. Inside was a handful of coins and a single heavy silver locket, its surface etched with floral patterns. Jacob's breath caught in his chest. He opened it. It was not Elena's. The portrait inside was of a different woman. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was the work of the same man. This was the robber's practice run, or a trophy from another crime. Cletus was his man, and Cletus worked for Croft. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a chain forged in steel. As he rode out of the canyon, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows, he sensed he was not alone. 2 riders appeared on the ridge above him, their rifles glinting in the dying light. An ambush. They weren't trying to warn him off. They were there to silence him. The chase was furious and desperate. Jacob spurred his horse, weaving through the treacherous terrain, his ranger training taking over. Bullets whizzed past his head, smacking into the rocks around him. He was a target just as Elena had been. He pushed his horse harder, heading for a narrow pass he knew they couldn't follow 2 abreast. He made it through the riders, pulling up at the entrance, their curses echoing in the canyon. He had escaped, but the message was clear. He was getting too close. Croft was not just obstructing him. He was actively trying to kill him. The robbery, the locket, his wife's death, it was all part of a conspiracy, and Silas Croft was at the heart of it. Jacob rode through the night, not back to his homestead, but deeper into the Badlands, following a new, desperate plan. He had to find Cletus, but Cletus was likely long dead or buried deep in Croft's pocket. His only other lead was the second bandit, the one who had herded the customers. He remembered the man's limp or the way he favored his right leg. For a week, Jacob became a ghost living off the land, haunting the fringes of Croft's vast ranching empire. He watched the ranch hands from a distance, studying their movements, their habits. On the 8th day, he found him, a man named Miller, living in a squalid bunkhouse, his pronounced limp a dead giveaway. Miller was a drunk, his pay spent on whiskey before it was even earned. Jacob waited until Miller, deep in his cups, stumbled out of the saloon and into the dark alley behind it. Jacob cornered him, the muzzle of his Winchester pressed against the man's temple. The bank robbery, Jacob said, his voice a low growl. 2 years ago. I want to know why. Miller, his face pale with terror and cheap liquor, began to babble. It was just a job Croft paid us, said it was just to scare some folks, make the town see they needed his protection. You killed my wife, Jacob hissed. That wasn't part of the plan. Miller cried, tears streaming down his face. It went wrong and the sheriff started shooting. Cletus panicked. He wasn't even supposed to be there. The plan was just to grab the locket and run. The words hung in the air, confirming Jacob's darkest fears. The locket, why the locket? I don't know, Miller sobbed. Croft just said it was important, said the woman would be wearing it and that Cletus was to get it no matter what. He paid us double for it. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of unimaginable evil. As Jacob was processing the confession, a shadow fell over the alley entrance. It was one of Croft's foremen, a hulking man named Riggs. Miller, you talk too much, Riggs said, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. The alley exploded into violence. Jacob shoved Miller aside and fired from the hip. The shot went wide, but it bought him a second. Riggs returned fire, the bullet grazing Jacob's arm, and the pain a hot, searing shock. Jacob dove behind a stack of crates as Riggs advanced. He knew he was outgunned. This was not a fight he could win. He had the truth, but it was useless if he was dead. Using the crates as cover, he scrambled to the end of the alley, clambered over a fence, disappeared into the night. The shouts of Croft's men echoing behind him. He was wounded, hunted, and now he held the terrible, incomplete truth. The robbery was a sham orchestrated by Croft to retrieve Elena's locket. But the final crucial question remained, why? What secret did that small piece of silver hold that was worth killing for? The bullet had torn a shallow but painful furrow along his left forearm. Hiding in a dry wash miles from town, Jacob grimly tore a strip from his shirt and bound the wound, his mind racing faster than the throbbing in his arm. He had the confession. He knew Croft was behind it all. But Miller's confession was the word of a drunken coward against the most powerful man in the valley. It wasn't enough. The secret was still locked away, and the key was the locket itself. He had to get back to the homestead. It was the last place Croft's men would expect him to go, assuming he had fled the territory. And it was where he kept the few things of Elena's he had managed to save. As he rode under the cloak of a moonless night, his thoughts turned to Elena's parents. They had been missionaries, gentle, devout people who had come west to minister to the Lakota 2 decades earlier. They had died in a fire that swept through their mission, a tragedy Elena rarely spoke of. She had been away at a school in the East at the time, a fact that had saved her life, but burdened her with a lifetime of guilt. She had inherited little from them, a Bible, a few letters, and the locket. He reached his cabin before dawn, slipping through the darkness like a wraith. Inside, he went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He lifted the lid, the scent of dried lavender, Elena's favorite, rising to meet him. He carefully took out a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from her mother to her father, written in a delicate looping script. He had read them once long ago, finding them to be simple expressions of love and faith. But now he read them with new eyes, searching for a clue, a hint, anything. He found it in the last letter written just days before the fire. My dearest Charles, I pray this letter finds you well on your journey. The tensions here are growing. Lieutenant Croft, the Army officer from the nearby fort, has become more demanding. He speaks of the Lakota in this valley as vermin and covets their land with a fervor that frightens me. He has been pressing Chief Ironcloud to sign a new treaty, one that would cede the valley to the government. Ironcloud has refused. I fear Croft will not take no for an answer. He is a man with no honor. I have secured the original treaty map and the deed the one President Grant signed guaranteeing this valley to Ironcloud's people in perpetuity. I have hidden it for safekeeping. If anything should happen, Elena will know where to find it. Our little silver secret. The letter ended there. Lieutenant Croft, a man with no honor, our little silver secret. Jacob's blood ran cold. He picked up Elena's Bible, his hands trembling. He had always assumed the locket held portraits of her parents, but it was large, heavy, and unusually thick. With the tip of his knife, he carefully worked at the back of the locket's frame. In the one photograph he had of it, a small tintype they'd taken together. He imagined prying it open. What would he find? Not a second portrait. There was a hidden compartment. Inside, folded with incredible precision, would be a miniature, hand-drawn map, and on the back of the map, a tiny legally binding land deed. The massacre. The mission fire wasn't an accident. Croft, a disgraced U.S. Army officer, had murdered Chief Ironcloud, and his peaceful village burned the mission to destroy the witnesses, Elena's parents, and stolen the land, forging a new deed to make it his own. The valley, his entire empire, was built on a foundation of slaughter and lies. Elena had carried the proof around her neck her entire life, completely unaware of the explosive secret it held. Croft must have found out somehow, perhaps through an old army record or a drunken confession from one of his men from that time. He had to get the locket back. His obsession with Jacob's land was not about the creek. It was about erasing the last link to Elena's family, silencing the last echo of his horrific crime. A floorboard creaked on the porch. Jacob looked up his hand, instinctively grabbing the Winchester. He wasn't alone. Peering through a crack in the shutters, he saw a lone Lakota warrior, sitting on his horse on the ridge, a silent silhouette against the graying dawn sky. It was the older boy, Chayton. He was not there as a threat. He was watching, waiting. Perhaps he had seen the riders chasing Jacob. Perhaps he was returning the favor, a silent guardian repaying a debt. Jacob knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to Sheriff Brody with this story. Not yet. He needed more than a letter and a theory. He needed a witness. He needed someone who knew what happened that day 20 years ago. And there was only one place to find that person. He had to find the descendants of Chief Ironcloud's people. He had to find Chief Black Eagle. Leaving a note for the boy he hoped was still watching, he slipped out the back of the cabin and into the tall grass, a man no longer just seeking vengeance for his wife, but justice for an entire people. With Chayton as his guide, Jacob traveled for 2 days, moving through the Badlands with a speed and stealth he thought he had forgotten. The boy was a natural scout, communicating with hand signals and a shared unspoken understanding. He led Jacob to the camp of his father, Chief Black Eagle. It was a small nomadic community, hidden deep within the protective embrace of the sacred Black Hills. When they arrived, Jacob was met with a wall of hostile, suspicious stares. He was an enemy, a white man, in a place where they were not welcome. But Chayton spoke with quiet authority, telling the story of the quicksand of the man who had laid down his weapon to save him and his brother. Chief Black Eagle, a man whose face was a roadmap of wisdom and sorrow, listened patiently. He was the son of Chief Ironcloud. When Jacob, speaking slowly and clearly, told his story of the locket, the letter, and Lieutenant Silas Croft, a profound, grief-stricken understanding dawned in the old chief's eyes. We have long known the story was a lie. Black Eagle said, his English measured and dignified. The elders who survived the fire spoke of a soldier with cold eyes leading the attack. They spoke of a sacred map, a promise from the Great Father in Washington, that was lost in the flames. Your wife's parents were good people. They died trying to protect us. It is a debt my people have never forgotten. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sheriff Brody, cowed by Croft's power, would never act on Jacob's word alone. But he could not ignore the living testimony of an entire people. Jacob now had a choice. He could lead a war party back to Redemption Creek and take his vengeance in blood, a path that would only lead to more death and sorrow. Or he could do it the Rangers' way with the law. He had to force a public confrontation. He had to expose Croft in front of the whole town, leaving him with nowhere to run. He laid out his plan to Black Eagle. It was dangerous relying on timing courage, and the hope that a man like Sheriff Brody had a conscience buried somewhere beneath his fear. Black Eagle agreed. He would not bring a war party. He would come as a witness to honor a debt and to see justice done for his father. Jacob rode back towards Redemption Creek, a marked man with a desperate plan. He sent word to Brody through Jebediah's stone, a cryptic message telling him to be in the center of town at dusk, that the truth about the valley's bloody history was about to be revealed. He was setting a trap using himself as bait. He knew Croft's spies would report his return. He knew Croft would not allow him to reach the sheriff. This time the confrontation would be on his terms in the open, where the secrets could no longer hide in the shadows. He holed up in the abandoned livery stable at the edge of town, cleaning his Winchester, checking the action on his old Colt Peacemaker, which he had retrieved from its resting place in his cabin. The sky outside darkened the air, growing heavy and electric. A storm was coming both in the heavens and on the dusty street of Redemption Creek. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was an instrument of a justice that was 20 years overdue. Dusk fell on Redemption Creek, like a purple shroud, the setting sun painting the undersides of the bruised, storm-heavy clouds in shades of orange and blood. A nervous energy gripped the town. The saloons were quiet, the streets unnaturally empty. Jebediah's message had spread, and the people waited, sensing a reckoning was at hand. A low roll of thunder echoed from the west, a drumbeat for the drama about to unfold. Jacob stepped out of the shadows of the livery stable. His long coat hiding the Colt at his hip, the Winchester held loosely in one hand. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of town, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He stopped in the open space between the saloon and the sheriff's office, a lone figure in the growing gloom. As if on cue, Silas Croft and 4 of his hired guns emerged from the saloon. Croft's face was a mask of smug confidence, but a flicker of unease danced in his eyes. McGregor Croft called out, his voice booming with false authority. "I heard you were back. Crawling out of your hole to cause more trouble, I see. You should have kept running. I'm done running, Croft." Jacob said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. "I'm here to talk about a piece of land, a valley, and a massacre that happened 20 years ago." A nervous murmur rippled through the onlookers, peering from windows and doorways. Croft's smile tightened. "You've been out in the sun too long. Your grief has curdled your mind." At that moment, from the west, a new presence made itself known. Chief Black Eagle and 20 of his warriors rode into town. They were not painted for war. They carried no rifles. They rode with a solemn, powerful dignity, their faces set like stone. At the head of the procession, 2 men led 5 beautiful horses, a gift of honor. They came to a stop behind Jacob, a silent, unshakable wall of witnesses. From the east, Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies appeared, their expressions a mixture of fear and resolve. They had been drawn into the center of a storm they could not control. Croft's composure finally cracked. This was not the scenario he had envisioned. He had expected to corner a lone, broken man. Instead, he was facing a public tribunal. "See," Sheriff Croft shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Black Eagle. Just like I warned, he's brought them here. They're going to attack McGregor, made a deal with them. They're not here to attack Croft. Jacob said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. They're here as witnesses. To the truth. Jacob's gaze swept the crowd. 20 years ago, a U.S. Army lieutenant named Silas Croft massacred a peaceful Lakota village to steal this valley. He murdered their chief, and he murdered 2 missionaries who knew the truth, my wife's parents. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Croft's face turned a mottled red. Lies, the ravings of a madman. Is it? Jacob countered. Your men raided the bank 2 years ago, not for money, but for a silver locket that belonged to my wife. A locket that contained the original deed to this land, signed by President Grant, proving your entire life is a fraud. The ticking of the clock in the general store seemed to grow louder, each second stretching into an eternity. The first drops of rain began to fall fat and heavy, spattering in the dust. The secondary twist, the one Jacob had gambled on, came from the man in the middle. Sheriff Brody looked at the hard, determined face of Jacob McGregor. He looked at the regal, sorrowful eyes of Chief Black Eagle. Then he looked at the panicked, guilty face of Silas Croft, the man who had owned him for years. And in that moment, something inside the weary lawman broke. Shame duty, or a long-dormant shred of courage, rose to the surface. He drew his revolver, not pointing it at the Lakota, but leveling it directly at Silas Croft. The law in this town isn't for sale anymore. Silas Brody said, his voice shaking but clear. Drop your guns. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Croft, his face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred, made his choice. Kill them all, he screamed. The street erupted. Croft's men went for their guns, but Jacob was faster. His ranger training was a fluid, lethal dance. The Winchester came up, fired, and one of the gunmen fell. He worked the lever action, fired again, and a second man staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Black Eagle and his warriors did not draw weapons. They held their ground, their presence alone, a powerful deterrent to the townsfolk joining the fight. Sheriff Brody fired his shot, going wide, but forcing Croft to take cover behind a water trough. The remaining 2 gunmen focused their fire on Jacob, pinning him down. Rain began to fall in earnest, now turning the street to a slick, muddy track, the lamplight glinting off wet rifle barrels. Jacob knew he had to end it. He holstered his Winchester and drew his Colt, the familiar weight a comfort in his hand. He waited for a lull in the shooting, then broke from cover, running low and fast firing, with a precision that was terrifying to behold. He shot the gun from one man's hand and put a bullet in the leg of the other. Now it was just him and Croft. Croft rose from behind the trough, his face a mask of desperation and fury, a pistol in his hand. You, he roared, firing wildly. Jacob didn't fire back. He walked forward, his steps steady in the pouring rain, his Colt held loosely at his side. He was closing the distance, giving Croft nowhere to run. The fight was precise, tactical, a final dramatic duel in the muddy main street. Croft fired again, the bullet tugging at Jacob's sleeve. He fired his last shot, the hammer clicking on an empty chamber. Jacob stopped at 10 feet from him. He raised his peacemaker, the aim unwavering, the cold finality of the moment reflected in his eyes. This is for Elena, he said, his voice low and steady. He squeezed the trigger. The single gunshot echoed through the rain-soaked town, a final definitive punctuation mark. Silas Croft crumpled into the mud, the lie of his life extinguished. A collective sigh of shock and relief passed through the crowd. It was over. In the aftermath, a new order began to assert itself. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, but his shoulders straighter than they had been in years, walked over to Croft's fallen gunmen. The rest of you, he called out to Croft's few remaining loyalists cowering in the saloon, are under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Finding his courage, he began the long, difficult work of restoring true law to Redemption Creek. Chief Black Eagle approached Jacob the Rain, plastering his graying hair to his temples. He looked from Jacob to the body of Croft, then to the horses his men held nearby. The debt for my sons is paid, he said, his voice deep with emotion. Today a much older debt has been honored as well. The spirit of my father can rest. Jacob nodded, the adrenaline beginning to drain from him, leaving a profound emptiness in its wake. He walked to Croft's body and knelt in the mud. He reached into the man's coat pocket and pulled out the silver locket. It was warm from Croft's body, a profane violation. He clutched it in his hand, the smooth, worn silver, a painful, tangible link to the past. This was what it had all been for. Not vengeance, but this. The return of a memory. The restoration of a truth. As Black Eagle and his people turned to leave their solemn procession, disappearing into the stormy darkness, Jacob stood alone in the center of the street, the locket in one hand, his pistol in the other, the rain washing the blood and the dust from the town he had just saved from itself. Weeks later, a fragile peace settled over the valley. The story of Silas Croft's treachery and Jacob McGregor's quest for justice became the founding legend of a renewed Redemption Creek. The town council, led by a newly confident Sheriff Brody, formally offered Jacob the position of town marshal. He respectfully declined. His war was over. All he wanted now was the peace he had come here to find 2 years ago. The final scene of his long journey took place on a windswept hill overlooking his homestead. Here, under a lone cottonwood tree, was a simple wooden cross that marked Elena's grave. The prairie, washed clean by the storm, was bursting with late-season wildflowers. Jacob knelt and placed a single wild prairie rose on the mound of earth. He pulled the locket from his pocket. His hand steady now opened the clasp. Inside, just as he remembered, was the miniature, hand-painted portrait of Elena, her smile full of life and hope. He looked at it not with the raw, tearing anguish of before, but with a quiet, bittersweet sorrow that was finally beginning to feel like peace. He closed it with a soft click, a final, gentle farewell. He stood, his gaze sweeping over the vast, now peaceful landscape of Cottonwood Creek. In his corral, the 5 gift horses grazed freely, their presence a living symbol of the unlikely bond he had forged between 2 cultures, a bridge built of mercy and respect. He was no longer a man hollowed out by grief, but a man who had faced the ghosts of the past, his own, and the land's, and had emerged whole. He had found justice for Elena, and in doing so had found a new beginning for himself. He stood tall, a solitary figure, against the endless sky, a healed man, finally at home in the silence.